New Zealand's grasslands are the envy of many other farming countries. They're the solid foundation of our economy. We've got a worldwide reputation for excellent grassland management. The pastures of the plains and the gentle hill country can carry large numbers of animals and are stable and highly productive when properly managed. Unhappily, though, there's another side to the coin. In the high country of both islands, there's evidence of land use that's unwise, to say the least. Nowhere is this more obvious than in the Poverty Bay East Cape region of the North Island, where a broad band of seriously eroded country stretches from Gisborne almost to the Cape. Felling and burning the native forests on this steep, unstable hill country and introducing sheep and cattle have caused erosion so serious and so disastrous that it's probably one of the worst examples of its kind, if not the worst, anywhere in the world. Sad to say, it's not the only example in New Zealand. Seen from the ground, some of the slips are almost frightening, discharging thousands of tons of debris which move down to the river valleys, building up wide fans of rubble. In some areas, erosion has been so severe that all that's left is a deep ravine, its sides seamed and scarred with gullies. And erosion is still going on. Debris washes down to cover pasture land. Eventually, some of the once productive valley bottoms are buried under a carpet of rubble. River valleys have been filled with debris until they look like wide, stony plains. How did this happen? To find out, we'll have to go back to just before the turn of the century, when most of the region's high country was still covered with dense forest, almost untouched by man. The higher hills were clothed in beech, with tawa, rimu, totara, matsai and kahikatea on the lower slopes. Bush spread right down the hillsides into the river valleys where streams ran fast and clear, except during big floods. The forest canopy and the understory sheltered the ground from the direct impact of rain, and roots helped hold the soil in place. Shrubs and ferns on the forest floor grew dense and lush, and a layer of humus and litter soaked up water like a sponge. But in the late 1890s and early 1900s, this scene started to change as giant trees began to fall under the saws and axes of European settlers who'd moved into the area. Man-made fires destroyed vast areas of forest, and eyewitness accounts tell of the sky being black with smoke for days on end. At night, the hills for miles around were lit up with a red glare. Millions of trees were burnt on the spot and wasted. But to men struggling to make farms out of a forest wilderness, one blade of grass was worth 2 trees. So they packed in grass seed on horseback and sowed it between the dead, fire-blackened stumps and fallen branches. The grass grew fast because the soil was naturally fertile. The new pastures carried as many as 12 sheep to the hectare. Most farmers were prosperous indeed for a few years. But even in those early days, when wagons piled high with wool bales were rolling across the riverbeds, government geologists were sounding warnings that the land was unstable and erosion-prone. In wet seasons, they said, every hillside is scarred with slips. They recommended that all felling and burning in the headwater valleys should stop, and but any such valleys already cleared should be replanted with trees. But the destruction of the forests went on. The settlers didn't accept reports that their paddocks were likely to slip away, or if they did, they turned a blind eye to them. And they didn't know that natural earth movements over millions of years have gradually twisted and contorted the rock layers of the region. Earthquakes and movements along fault lines have shattered and crushed the rocks, until in some areas they can be crumbled by hand into small fragments. As a result, the soil and rocks have little strength or stability. Cracks allow water to penetrate deep down, weakening whole hillsides, making them liable to collapse in slips and earth flows after heavy rain. And it can rain here. 100 millimetres in a day is not uncommon. Deluges of 250 millimetres in 24 hours have been recorded. So the scene was set for erosion on a grand scale, because the forest cover had gone. The land was inherently unstable. Grass had replaced trees. No longer were the canopy, the understory and the roots there to protect and bind the soil. By the early 1920s, whole hillsides had slipped away. Millions of tons of debris had washed into river valleys. To show how the riverbeds have risen, this old photograph taken in 1916 is of the Rip Bridge near Ruatoria. Its buttresses were several metres above the riverbed. But let's look at the scene today from about the same position. The bridge seen here is a new one. The old bridge has been completely buried, except for the tops of its buttresses, which are just visible. Here's the 1916 photograph again, with the present-day level of the riverbed marked on it. As erosion increased, so production decreased, and prosperity declined. People started to leave the region. Small towns were hardest hit because they were almost entirely dependent on farming. A series of exceptionally bad storms made matters much worse, and many local people woke up to the seriousness of the situation. After the Second World War, they tried to control runoff by building brushwood dams and piping water down gullies, but not much of this work can be seen today. In 1948, a huge flood did millions of dollars worth of damage. It became obvious that the problem was beyond local resources. It would have to be tackled as a national effort and financed by government. Mr. A.D. Todd, then Chief Engineer of the Poverty Bay Catchment Board, was the driving force in getting the problem examined by a committee appointed by government. He was a member of this committee, which made several recommendations. By far the most important was that trees should be planted on a very large scale in the eroded areas. This was the turning point in the fight against erosion in the East Cape region, and led to the creation of Mangatu State Forest in one of the worst areas. Once again, trees would stand where, less than a century ago, native forests had covered the land. Only this time, they'd be fast-growing, introduced species, planted by man. They might march across the countryside in straight, regimented rows, but they'd be doing the same job as their predecessors, protecting the soil against rain and binding it with their roots. Although tree planting won't stop exceptionally heavy floods like the 1948 one, it will help to stabilise the ground and reduce the flow of debris into riverbeds. The Forest Service started planting in 1960 and had largely completed the job by 1980. But this was only one job among many in establishing a new forest over massive slides and earth flows, huge slips and gullies, and riverbeds choked with debris. Land had to be acquired, roads surveyed and built in steep, unstable country, staff recruited and trained, accommodation provided for the workforce, and a nursery started to produce the trees for planting out. Today, Mangatu Forest covers 12,000 hectares and looks peaceful and settled, with trees stretching almost as far as the eye can see. Most of the small erosion scars have disappeared under the healing mantle of foliage. But the big slips and slumps can still be seen. Early efforts at Mangatu showed that it was better to plant relatively stable land first, bypassing areas of greatest instability. Bypassed areas are planted after their condition has improved. Trees established on the surrounding, more stable ground help to soak up the excess water, which causes the land to slip in the first place. Planting is now underway on the bare faces and fans of some of the large slips. And although debris is still discharged from them after heavy rain, it's hoped that deforestation will eventually seal them off. In areas considered suitable for timber production, the radiata pine trees are pruned to produce knot-free, high-quality wood. But Mangatu is primarily a protection forest, and timber production will only be planned where it doesn't jeopardize the vital protection role. Of course, any trees felled will be replaced. Some of the earliest plantings are now approaching merchantable size. Beneath their canopy, native shrubs and ferns are starting to form an understory again, giving additional protection to the forest floor and providing shelter and food for wildlife. But there are still some active earth flows. Although indications are that tree planting has slowed down earth movement, we still don't know exactly how much it's done so. To find out, research staff set up an experiment using modern electronic equipment capable of very accurate measurement to compare the rate of earth flow movement on adjacent planted and unplanted slopes. Lines of pegs were driven into the ground about 1 kilometre away on the opposite side of the Waipoa River Valley. The slopes were specially selected as being likely to move. Precise measurements of the pegs were taken at regular intervals over a considerable period of time. This work will show how much the pegs move, if at all, and any differences in movement patterns between planted and unplanted slopes. It will also provide information for anyone who may wish to use radiata pine's proven qualities of easy establishment and fast growth to stabilise land, instead of using it in its more usual role as a wood producer. Staff of the Forest Research Institute, together with a consultant geologist, have studied the geological structure of Mangatu Forest and the surrounding area, the distribution of its different rock types, and the mineral and chemical makeup of its rocks. One result has been the production of a geological map of the area, which shows, among other things, the fault lines and zones of greatest potential instability caused by crushing and shearing of the rocks. They're studying the water chemistry of the area as well. Some rocks are held together by a cement of calcium carbonate. Measurement of the calcium and other minerals contained in water samples from local streams has helped confirm that certain rock types are progressively weakened by exposure to the weather. They've also devised a system of classifying land into a number of stability types. In some of these land types, slope stability and erosion potential are of critical importance in land management. From the forestry point of view, decisions such as where roads should be sited, what species should be planted, and how the plantation should be managed will depend largely on this terrain stability classification. Above all, it will help to identify areas where the protective role of the forest must take precedence over production. But important as Mangatu is, it's not the only forest in the East Cape region. It's now seen as the nucleus of a much larger forest, which will ultimately cover 100,000 hectares of critical watersheds from Mangatu almost to the Cape. New forests, which will fit into this plan, are being planted by the Forest Service, or have already been planted. Private companies, too, are planting up big blocks of land in the high country. In Ruatoria State Forest, trees are growing well over a large area of steep, very badly eroded country in the shadow of Mount Honokawa. Ultimately, this forest could cover 20,000 hectares. But what evidence is there to show that trees are doing the job they were planted for, getting erosion under control? First of all, look at this old photograph of the Homestead Creek area of Mangatu Forest, taken before planting had started. Then the moving slopes were so wet that men working on them had to wear thigh boots. The flow of debris down the creek was so great, and the fan so unstable, that at times travelling between the headquarters and the camp was extremely difficult. But a more recent photograph shows a very different picture. The trees have almost completely stabilised the slopes, although there are still some small areas of movement. The debris fan is now a firm, grassy flat. The creek is contained between its banks, and a permanent road leads over a culvert to the camp. Secondly, some of the rapidly eroding slopes at Mangatu have now been under trees for several years, and there haven't been any new major slips for some time. However, in unplanted areas surrounding Ruatoria Forest, erosion still goes on. Thirdly, there's no doubt that in some planted catchments, the riverbeds are going down instead of rising as they have done for years. The reason for this is that the trees are stabilising and binding the soil, and less debris is moving down the slopes and reaching the valley floor. Rivers are now cutting into the rubble stored on the valley bottoms. Here's a good example. The scratch marks on the bridge pillar show the old debris level, about 3 metres above the present-day riverbed. And this has happened in only a few years. Fourthly, some of the streams draining the first catchments to be planted are noticeably clearer than the main rivers. And aquatic life is returning to them. But forestry in the East Cape means much more than just a change from grass to trees. It's giving local people long-term, well-paid jobs, and is helping to reverse the drift away from rural areas. The men at the centre of it all are the forest managers like John Ruru at Mangatu. The forests themselves provide a wide range of jobs, many of which are ideally suited to the local people, who find outdoor work in a rural setting very much to their liking, particularly when it's in their own home area where their families and friends are. As the concept of the East Cape Forest develops, so more and more local people will become involved with forestry. New industries will be established. It's likely that exports of wood and wood products will play a big part in the region's future. Forestry will take its place as a major land use in the East Cape. But the vital message for New Zealanders comes through loud and clear. Land is our most valuable asset, and we must make the best possible use of it. Farming isn't necessarily the be-all and end-all of land use, nor, of course, is forestry. But New Zealand was originally a forested country. we've learnt the hard way that forestry is a much better use for some types of land in some areas than agriculture. The Poverty Bay, East Cape region is but one of these areas. There are others where unstable land and climatic extremes should have warned us that to change from trees to grass would be unwise. Whether or not we heed these warnings is up to us. If we don't, then we've no one to blame but ourselves.